The letter arrived on a Tuesday, crumpled and stained, as if it had been carried across the country in someone's back pocket. Ezra Coleman, 17, stood frozen in the dim hallway of his family's Nebraska farmhouse, the words "faggot" and "disgrace" burning through the paper into his trembling hands. By nightfall, his bags were packed, and his father's final words, "You're no son of mine," echoed as the screen door slammed shut behind him. 10 years later, Ezra's face stared out from the glossy cover of Forbes, his sharp jawline and piercing green eyes framed by the headline, "The prodigy behind Nexus AI." The world knew him as the 27-year-old tech genius who'd built a billion-dollar empire from nothing, a beacon of resilience for every kid kicked out for being who they were. But as Ezra stood in his sleek San Francisco penthouse, staring at that same cover, a knot tightened in his chest. The story the world loved, the scrappy queer kid who clawed his way to the top, was a lie. Not entirely, but enough to unravel everything if the truth ever surfaced. His phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. A text from Julian Navarro, his boyfriend of 2 years. "Dinner at 7? I'm cooking." Ezra smiled, the warmth of Julian's words cutting through the chill of his thoughts. Julian, 28, with his easy laugh and unwavering belief in Ezra, was the one person who made the lies feel bearable. But even Julian didn't know the whole truth. Not yet. Ezra's journey began in a Greyhound station in Omaha, a scared teenager with $47 and a backpack, heading west because it was the only direction that felt like freedom. San Francisco welcomed him with open arms but sharp edges. Its vibrant Castro district pulsed with life, yet its streets were unforgiving to a kid with no plan. He slept in shelters, worked odd jobs, and taught himself to code on library computers, fueled by a desperate need to prove his worth. By 20, he'd landed a gig at a startup, where his raw talent caught the eye of investors. By 25, he'd founded Nexus AI, a company revolutionizing machine learning for healthcare. The media ate it up. The gay kid from nowhere who'd turned pain into power. But the real story, the one Ezra buried deep, was messier. It wasn't just grit that got him here. It was a deal, a secret, and a betrayal he'd carried like a stone in his gut. Back in those early days, broke and starving, Ezra had stumbled into a shady gig, writing code for a data broker named Victor Klein. Victor, a wiry man with a shark smile, offered Ezra a lifeline: cash for untraceable scripts that harvested user data. Ezra didn't ask questions, he needed to eat. But when Nexus AI took off, those scripts became a ticking time bomb. Victor had leverage, and he wasn't afraid to use it. "Ezra, you in there?" Julian's voice snapped him out of his reverie. He hadn't heard the door open. Julian stood in the kitchen, his dark curls catching the light, a grocery bag in one hand. "You look like you saw a ghost." Ezra forced a smile. "Just thinking about work." He crossed the room, pulling Julian into a kiss, letting the warmth of it anchor him. Julian smelled like cedar and citrus, grounding in a way Ezra hadn't known he needed until they met. They'd collided at a tech conference 2 years ago, Julian a journalist covering the event, Ezra the keynote speaker. Julian's sharp questions and sharper wit had hooked Ezra instantly, and their first date, a late-night walk through the Mission District, had felt like the start of something real. "You sure you're okay?" Julian asked, his brown eyes searching Ezra's face. "You've been off lately." "I'm fine," Ezra lied, his voice steady but his heart racing. He couldn't tell Julian about Victor, not when the man had texted him last week. "Forbes won't care about your sob story if they know what you did." The threat was clear. Victor could expose the dirty code that had funded Ezra's early days, the code that still lingered in Nexus AI's foundations. If it came out, the company would tank, and Ezra's carefully crafted image would shatter. As they sat down to dinner, Julian's homemade tacos, a recipe from his abuela, Ezra tried to focus on the moment. Julian talked about his latest article, a deep dive into tech ethics, and Ezra nodded along, half listening. His mind kept drifting to the past, to the choices he'd made when survival trumped morality. He'd been so young, so desperate, but now, with everything he'd built teetering on the edge, those choices felt like chains. "Ezra," Julian said, setting down his fork, "you're not here. What's going on?" Ezra hesitated, the truth clawing at his throat. He wanted to tell Julian everything about Victor, the code, the lie that had become his life. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached across the table, squeezing Julian's hand. "I'm just stressed. Big meeting tomorrow." Julian didn't look convinced, but he let it go, his thumb brushing over Ezra's knuckles. "You know you can talk to me, right? Whatever it is." Ezra nodded, his chest tight. He wanted to believe that, but as he looked into Julian's eyes, he saw the man who'd made him believe in love again, and the man he could lose if the truth came out. The lie had brought him this far, but it was starting to crack, and Ezra didn't know how much longer he could hold it together. The next morning, Ezra woke to the San Francisco fog pressing against his penthouse windows, a gray veil that mirrored his mood. He'd barely slept, Victor's threat looping in his mind like a bad song. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed again. A new message from an unknown number. "Meet me at Pier 39, 2 p.m. Don't make me wait." No signature, but Ezra knew it was Victor. The man had a knack for showing up when Ezra's life felt too good to be true. He dressed carefully, tailored blazer, crisp white shirt, armor for a battle he wasn't ready to fight. Julian was already gone, off to interview a whistleblower for his next story. Ezra envied Julian's clarity, his unapologetic pursuit of truth. If only Ezra could live that way. Instead, he was headed to a tourist trap to face a ghost from his past. Pier 39 was chaos. Seagulls squawking, street performers drumming, and families snapping photos. Ezra spotted Victor leaning against a railing, his thinning hair slicked back, a cheap suit clinging to his frame. At 45, Victor looked like he'd aged a decade since Ezra last saw him, but his eyes still glinted with that predatory edge. "You're late," Victor said, not looking up from his phone. "Traffic," Ezra replied, keeping his voice flat. "What do you want?" Victor smirked, finally meeting Ezra's gaze. "You're a big shot now, huh? Forbes cover boy. Bet your boyfriend's proud." The way he said boyfriend made Ezra's skin crawl, like Victor was holding a knife to Julian's existence. "Get to the point," Ezra snapped. Victor pulled out a USB drive, dangling it like bait. "This has everything. The code you wrote for me, the data you scraped. Names, addresses, socials, millions of them. You think Nexus is clean? It's built on this." Ezra's stomach dropped. He'd always known the code was dirty, but hearing it laid bare felt like a punch. "That was years ago. I was a kid." "Doesn't matter," Victor said. "One leak and your empire's done. Investors hate scandals. And the press? They'll eat you alive." Ezra clenched his fists, fighting the urge to knock the smirk off Victor's face. "What do you want, Victor?" 10 million, Victor said, his voice low. "Cash, untraceable, or this goes public." Ezra laughed, bitter and sharp. "You think I have that lying around?" "You'll find it," Victor said, slipping the USB drive back into his pocket. "You're good at finding ways out of messes, Ezra. Always were." As Victor walked away, blending into the crowd, Ezra felt the world tilt. 10 million was impossible. Not because he didn't have it, but because paying Victor would only buy silence until the next demand. He needed a plan, but his mind was a fog of panic and guilt. Back at his office, Nexus AI's headquarters buzzed with energy. Coders hunched over laptops, whiteboards scrawled with algorithms. Ezra's team saw him as a visionary, a leader who'd risen from nothing. But as he sat in his glass-walled office, staring at the city skyline, he felt like a fraud. The lie wasn't just about the code. It was about who he'd become. The world saw a hero, but Ezra saw a kid who'd sold his soul to survive. His assistant, Priya, knocked on the door. "Ezra, you've got a call with the board in 10. And Julian's on line 2. Ezra's heart lifted at Julian's name, then sank. He couldn't face him now, not with Victor's threat hanging over him. "Tell him I'll call back," he said, his voice hollow. Priya frowned but nodded, closing the door. Ezra leaned back, closing his eyes. He remembered the first time he'd felt safe after leaving Nebraska. A night in a San Francisco shelter when a volunteer, a trans woman named Marla, had given him a hot meal and a blanket. "You're enough," she'd said, her voice soft but firm. Those words had carried him through the darkest days, but now they felt like a taunt. Was he enough? Or was he just the sum of his mistakes? His phone buzzed again. Another text from Victor, 48 hours. Ezra's pulse raced. He needed to tell someone. But who? Julian deserved the truth, but the thought of losing him was unbearable. And Nexus, hundreds of employees, millions of users, depended on him. If he went down, so did they. That night, Ezra canceled dinner with Julian, claiming a work emergency. He drove to Ocean Beach, the waves crashing under a starless sky. The cold bit at his skin as he stood at the water's edge, replaying every choice that had led him here. He'd built a life he loved, but it was balanced on a lie. And now, with Victor closing in, Ezra had to decide. Fight, pay, or confess, and risk losing everything. Ezra didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk, the city's lights blurring outside his window, drafting emails he'd never send. One to Julian, spilling everything. Another to his board, resigning. A third to Victor, begging for mercy. Each felt like a surrender, and Ezra wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. By morning, he'd made a decision. He'd fight. Not with money, but with the truth, or at least part of it. He called Marla, the shelter volunteer who'd become a mentor over the years. At 50, Marla ran a nonprofit for queer youth, her warmth and wisdom a lifeline Ezra still leaned on. She picked up on the first ring. "Ezra, you sound like hell," she said, her voice a mix of concern and teasing. "What's wrong?" He told her everything: Victor, the code, the blackmail. Marla listened, her silence heavy but kind. When he finished, she sighed. "You were a kid, Ezra. You made a mistake. But you're not that kid anymore." "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "If I pay him, it never ends. If I don't, he ruins me." "Then take away his power," Marla said. "Tell the truth on your terms. Not all of it, maybe, but enough to show you're not afraid. People forgive honesty. They don't forgive cover-ups." Ezra hung up, her words echoing. Tell the truth. It sounded simple, but it meant risking Nexus, his reputation, Julian. Still, the idea took root. He spent the day digging through old files, piecing together evidence of Victor's operation. If he was going down, he'd take Victor with him. That evening, Julian showed up at the penthouse unannounced, his face tight with worry. "You've been dodging me," he said, stepping inside. "What's going on, Ezra?" Ezra's throat tightened. He wanted to lie, to protect Julian from the mess, but Marla's words stopped him. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Julian sat on the couch, his eyes steady. I'm listening. Ezra paced, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. He told Julian about Victor, the data scripts, the lie he'd let the world believe. He didn't mention the Forbes cover, not yet. Admitting he'd built his story on half-truths was too much. But he laid bare the deal that had started it all, the desperation that had driven him to it. Julian listened, his face unreadable. When Ezra finished, the silence was deafening. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Julian asked, his voice soft but edged with hurt. I was scared, Ezra said, of losing you, of losing everything. Julian stood, crossing the room to stand in front of Ezra. You think I'd leave you over this? I love you, Ezra, but you have to trust me. You can't keep carrying this alone. Ezra's eyes burned, and he pulled Julian into a hug, clinging to him like a lifeline. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. But it was short-lived. His phone buzzed, Victor again, time's running out. Pier 39, tomorrow. The next day, Ezra met Victor at the pier, this time with a plan. He'd brought a recorder, hidden in his jacket, and a lawyer friend, Lena, waiting nearby. If Victor wanted to play dirty, Ezra would play smarter. You got my money? Victor asked, his eyes darting around. I'm not paying you, Ezra said, his voice steady. But I've got something better. Proof you ran an illegal data operation. You leak my past, I leak yours. Mutually assured destruction. Victor's smirk faltered. You're bluffing. Try me, Ezra said, stepping closer. I've got nothing left to lose. Victor stared, then laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You think you're untouchable because you're some queer hero? You're nothing without that lie. Ezra's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. Maybe, but I'm done running. Victor walked away, but Ezra knew it wasn't over. That night, he sat with Julian drafting a statement. Not the full truth, not yet, but a version that admitted to early mistakes in his career, framed as a young man's desperation. It was a risk, but Marla was right. Honesty could disarm Victor's threat, at least for now. As they worked, Julian reached for Ezra's hand, his touch steadying. We'll get through this, he said. Together. Ezra nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. The truth was a tightrope, and he was only halfway across. The statement went out the next morning, a carefully worded press release sent to every major outlet. Ezra sat in his office watching the internet explode. Blogs dissected his words, X-posts debated his motives, and his inbox filled with messages, some supportive, others vicious. Hero or fraud? One headline read. Ezra's stomach churned, but Julian's hand on his shoulder kept him grounded. You did the right thing, Julian said, his voice firm. The truth doesn't have to destroy you. But Ezra wasn't so sure. The board called an emergency meeting, their faces grim across the conference table. Priya, his assistant, gave him a reassuring nod, but even she looked nervous. The chair, a no-nonsense woman named Diane, didn't mince words. This could tank our stock, Ezra. Why didn't you tell us? I thought I could handle it, Ezra said, his voice steady despite the panic in his chest. I was wrong. Diane leaned back, her eyes narrowing. We'll stand by you for now, but we need a plan to contain this. Ezra nodded, outlining his strategy. Full transparency with the board, an audit of Nexus's code to ensure no trace of Victor's data remained, and a public apology tour. It was grueling, but it might save the company. As the meeting ended, Diane pulled him aside. Your lucky people love a redemption story, she said. Don't screw this up. That night, Ezra and Julian walked through the Castro, the neon lights of bars and rainbow flags casting a warm glow. It was their place, where they'd shared their first kiss, where Ezra had once felt like he could be himself. Now he felt exposed, like every passerby knew his secret. "You're quiet," Julian said, nudging him. "Talk to me." "I'm scared," Ezra admitted. "What if this isn't enough? What if Victor leaks everything?" "Then we fight," Julian said, stopping to face him. "You're not alone in this, Ezra. You've got me, Marla, your team. You've built something real, something good. Don't let one mistake define you." Ezra's throat tightened, and he pulled Julian close, their foreheads touching. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Bullshit," Julian said, smiling. "You deserve everything." But the next day brought a new blow. Victor hadn't backed down. A leaked email sent to every major tech outlet detailed Ezra's role in the data scheme, complete with snippets of code. The internet erupted again, this time with no mercy. Forbes retracted their cover story, and Nexus's stock plummeted 20%. Ezra's phone rang nonstop, reporters, investors, friends. He ignored them all, retreating to his penthouse with Julian. "We need to respond," Julian said, scrolling through the chaos on his laptop. "You can't hide." "I know," Ezra said, his voice hollow. "But what do I say? Yeah, I did it, and I lied about it? You say you were young, desperate, and you've spent every day since making it right," Julian said. "You say you're human." Ezra stared at him, the weight of a decade's guilt pressing down. Julian was right, but the truth felt like a blade. Still, he sat down with Julian, drafting a new statement, this one raw, unfiltered. He admitted to the code, to the deal with Victor, to the lie he'd let grow. He spoke of his fear, his shame, and his commitment to fixing Nexus. By midnight, it was done. They posted it to X, and Ezra braced for the fallout. To his shock, the response wasn't all hate. Queer activists rallied around him, sharing their own stories of survival. Employees posted messages of support, calling him a leader who'd given them a chance. Even Marla chimed in, "Proud of you, kid. Keep going." But Victor wasn't done. A new text arrived. "You think this saves you? I've got more." Ezra's blood ran cold. He showed Julian, who cursed under his breath. "We need to find him," Julian said, "before he does more damage." Ezra nodded, a plan forming. He called Lena, his lawyer, and together they dug into Victor's past. If Ezra was going to fall, he'd make sure Victor went down harder. Ezra and Lena worked through the night, piecing together Victor's trail. Bank records, old emails, and a tip from a former colleague revealed Victor's operation was bigger than Ezra had known. A network of shady deals stretching across the tech world. By dawn, they had enough to turn the tables. Lena filed a report with the FBI, attaching evidence of Victor's illegal data schemes. Ezra didn't know if it would stick, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Julian took to X, amplifying Ezra's story. His posts, raw, honest, and fiercely supportive, went viral, framing Ezra as a man owning his past, not hiding from it. The narrative shifted, slowly but surely. Nexus's stock stabilized, and the board, though wary, backed Ezra's leadership. The queer community's support grew louder, with hashtags like Ezra Stands trending. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a chance to rebuild. Victor disappeared after the FBI report, his threats silenced, for now. Ezra knew he might resurface, but the fear no longer paralyzed him. He'd faced the worst and come out breathing. Nexus launched an ethics initiative, led by Priya, to ensure transparency in their code. Ezra spoke at conferences not as a hero, but as a man who'd messed up and was trying to do better. One evening, Ezra and Julian stood on a hill overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, the city sparkling below. Ezra took Julian's hand, his heart full. "I thought I'd lose you," he said. Julian smiled, his eyes catching the last light of the day. "You're stuck with me, Coleman. Deal with it." Ezra laughed, pulling Julian into a kiss. The lie had nearly destroyed him, but the truth, messy, painful, human, had set him free. He wasn't the kid kicked out of Nebraska anymore, nor the untouchable prodigy on Forbes. He was Ezra, flawed and fighting, loved by a man who saw him for who he was. And that was enough. The world would keep judging, but Ezra had learned something. A story, even one built on a lie, could be rewritten. Not with perfection, but with courage. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ezra felt the weight of a decade lift, replaced by something lighter, hope.